And so, to resume with the story of my life, an electronic autobiography, um, with the Tamil terrorists that I met. I should preface this, though, rewind back a little bit by saying that I'd had another trauma. As we learned, I had the physical trauma of the appendectomy during my last year of college. But then after I was out of college for a couple of years, I had a crisis period. This was the period after I moved out of my mother's house and I was working the job at ASU and living by myself in a studio apartment before I had connected with a new circle of friends. I was pretty lonely and I was suffering from very severe depression and I was drinking heavily. And so I had to be hospitalized for depression at that point for about 5 days, something like that. I was cutting myself up. I cut myself up pretty badly. I was having suicidal ideation, and I went in to go see my psychotherapist with all these cuts all over my arms and legs. I was wearing shorts, it was summer, and he was like, "What's up with all this? I think you need to check yourself into a place here." And so I did, and so they ironed me out. I got straightened out. They put me on some med that all it did was make me tired. It didn't work. So I left there, and the med made me too tired. I tried to take it for a month, and it just didn't work, so I stopped taking that. But then I eventually quit my job at ASU. But prior to that, though, prior to quitting it, I met the terrorist, whom we'll call, let's say, Mohammed. That's actually the name that he gave me, that he went by, but I know that it was not his real name. And so what happened was I'm driving along in my golf cart, and he hitches a ride. He hops on, and we start talking about India and how I was studying Joseph Campbell and very much interested in reading the Upanishads, learning all these things about Indian metaphysics, Hinduism, and so forth. And he was a gold mine. He was an encyclopedia of religious information about all these different Indian traditions, Muslim traditions, Buddhist traditions, Hindu traditions. He knew all the stuff. He was very learned. He gave me his phone number. I gave him my phone number, and then we connected again, I think a few days later after that, and he told me he had no place to stay. He had been staying with a woman, and now that expired. And so he was in the country illegally, needless to say, and he was hopping around from house to house, staying wherever he could, doing odd jobs. He was good with his hands. He had carpentry skills, I believe, and he was doing odd jobs. He said he had no place to stay, so I let him crash on my couch for a couple of weeks. Now, the Tamil Tigers, if you don't know this, are one of the fiercest and most brutal terrorist groups in the world. Back in the 70s and down through the 90s. They originated in the 70s all the way down through the 90s. And they were so brutal that Al-Qaeda looked up to them. Al-Qaeda emulated a lot of their terrorist practices, such as synchronized attacks, and they invented the practice of wearing the suicide vest and recruiting females, suicide bombers and child soldiers. And the Tamils are a separatist group in Sri Lanka, a minority separatist group of Tamils that wanted to secede from Sri Lanka. And so that's the background. And so at the apartment where he was living with me, it was very wonderful. The way he had of modulating his world around him. I'd wake up in the morning and he'd be out sitting on my patio meditating, legs crossed in classic meditation fashion, very peaceful, very calm. And he'd always put on like some Ravi Shankar music that he found a tape cassette of Ravi Shankar and Philip Glass. He'd play that. It was very peaceful for an individual who had been through so much violence. He had a very peaceful demeanor and a quiet way of talking. And he always beat me at Scrabble. We played Scrabble. The dude knew 7 or 8 languages. And so he was able to beat me at Scrabble every single time. He was amazing. So then he told me a bit about his background, most of which is a blur to me. I don't remember, but it was extremely violent. He was telling me about how his mother and sister had both been tortured to death, that he had watched it happen, all these terrible things that had happened as a result of him being, a terrorist. And there was some sort of escape, a violent escape. I remember him talking about swimming in the ocean, getting on a boat at some point. So he was in the country illegally, and he was always trying to rehearse this fake identity speech that he had written out because he knew that he was going to have an interview with immigration, and he was worried about getting citizenship, and he was thinking about the possibility of marrying someone to stay in the country. So this individual Muhammad, had this. He was very extroverted, and he had this ability to hook up with anyone, anywhere, at any time. He was absolutely fearless in the way that he approached people, and he liked to specifically. I went along with him to various religious groups, so we would go and visit the Quakers. And he was doing an odd job for the Quakers. And so I learned about the practice of sitting in silence in the Quaker meeting hall, which was totally new to me, and I thought it was really interesting. We would go to a church group. We'd meet up at a Bible study church group, and he'd invariably get into irascible conversations where he'd start arguing with people about the meanings of various aspects of even Christianity he knew quite a bit about. And then we went to the Baha'i, this Persian offshoot religion. There's a beautiful Baha'i temple in Phoenix, and we went there, and I was really impressed with the ceremony and the beauty of it. And we hung out with the Baha'i for a while. They were all very interesting, wonderful individuals, very polite, nice, very formal. It was a totally new world. We were going religion hopping here, and it was really fascinating and a lot of fun. We met a lot of people. And I still had my social group I hadn't yet quit my job at ASU, so I still had my social group from there, the 40-year-olds that I was hanging out with. And I introduced him to them, and they loved him. He was about my age, a little bit older. He might have been about 30. I was in my mid-20s, I think. And so we went out and about across Phoenix, and Muhammad knew a lot about Marxism, and so he'd get into Marxist debates with the woman from Manhattan, the frigid 40-year-old from Manhattan who was a Marxist, and they would get into debates about Marxism, and he was very good at debating. And so we would go out and about and have various adventures, art events, coffee shops, museums, so forth. But then one night, we were getting drunk in my apartment, and he asked me if I want to rob a liquor store. He goes, with a straight face and without the slightest trace of irony, he goes, you want to rob a liquor store? And I was like, what are you talking about? He's like, well, I know where I can get us some guns, and then we can go rob a liquor store, and if they catch us, we'll just put the guns to our heads and blow our brains out. Now, it's a practice of the Tamil Tigers, I read, that they came equipped with cyanide capsules in case, in the event of capture by the government, they were to chew the cyanide capsules. So he sort of already had that paradigm in his head. But I was like, Muhammad, that's really not the type of thing I do. I was very careful and judicious how I put things. I didn't want to, offend him or insult him or anything. I was just like, it's not my cup of tea, Muhammad. I really would just prefer not to. Quoting Bartleby, the Scrivener, I'd prefer not to rob a liquor store. And so that was fine. He was like, no, that's cool. I get it. You're not that way. You're not that type. And I was like, yeah. So then he asked the 40-year-old to marry him for citizenship because he was getting desperate and he really wanted to somehow stay. And he was terrified of being deported back to Sri Lanka, where who knows what would happen to him there. And she took offense, and she called me on the phone and told me about it. She was like, I really resent your friend Mohammed asking me to marry him for citizenship. And I was like, well, just blow it off. Don't make a big deal out of it. And then Mohammed just sort of vanished. He sort of drifted away out of the picture. And the next time I heard from him, it was maybe a year later, and he called from New York, and he had become a taxi cab driver in New York. So that was the last I saw of him. So that was Mohammed. So now the Persians that he had introduced me to, one individual in particular I hit it off with, his name was Shahram. And so we would go hang out down in Tempe. Tempe at this time along Mill Avenue had been refurbished with a bunch of new coffee shops that were really hip. And it was bustling. It had been a terrible, dilapidated neighborhood up to that point. And these coffee shops really revitalized Mill Avenue. And it was thriving. It was the place to be if you were, a kid at ASU or in Tempe or whatever. It was the place to be. And so I would meet with Shahram, this Persian guy, at coffee shops. I had quit my job by this point at ASU, and that circle of friends did not come with me. It's usually the case when you quit a job that the job friends you have don't carry over. It just doesn't work that way. So I was looking for new friends, and I was hanging out with the Persian guy. So we would play chess. We would meet and play chess. And I like chess, although I'm not that good at it. So he would beat me every time. And I was intent on beating him at least once. I was very focused and concentrated on it. And then I looked over and I happened to see that some guy was sitting next to us, and he had gotten up to go refill his coffee cup, and the book that he was reading was The Hero with a Thousand Faces by Joseph Campbell. So he came back with his coffee cup, and I told him, hey, you know, the Joseph Campbell people are considering hiring me for a job. And I was like, Campbell's my thing. And so we hit it off. This was an individual with a very bad stutter. So he talked with a stutter. It was very hard for him to communicate. But I understood him nonetheless. Very high IQ, brilliant individual. And he said, oh, well, you have to meet my friend. He's a philosopher of mathematics from Berkeley. I was like, yeah, let's meet him. So this individual came over, the philosopher of mathematics from Berkeley. He graduated, I think, with an MA in philosophy of mathematics. So he knew his stuff. And he introduced us, and then the dude walked away. He was totally unimpressed with me. So I kind of had to win him over because I thought he was interesting, especially with that degree in philosophy of mathematics. And I was becoming interested in science at that time. And so every night I would go down to Coffee Plantation, which was packed with swarms of students, skateboarders, people living on the streets, you name it. It was a huge swarm of diversity going on there at that place. And the three of us would hang out every night, me and the kid with the stutter and the philosopher of mathematics. And the philosopher of mathematics and I then gradually did hit it off. It took a while for that to get off the ground. And we would stay up all night talking about quantum theory. He taught me almost everything I know about Einsteinian relativity and Whitehead and Russell's Principia Mathematica. He would go through that and tell me how all that worked, which I couldn't really understand, but I loved hearing it. And he was so erudite in science and knew all the basic science problems. Chaos theory was coming along at that point. This is the mid-90s. So we would stand out there all night long. Very often it was just the two of us going back and forth, science, humanities, science, humanities. It was left brain, right brain, back and forth all night long. Very often we were the last two people standing there by 4 a.m. By the time 4 a.m. rolled around, and we were standing there still with coffee in our coffee cups because we were constantly, they had coffee jugs out there that you could get free refills from. If you just held on to your cup from the previous night, you could just go fill it up every night. Because I didn't have any money, I wasn't working at that point. So I was just surviving on free coffee from Coffee Plantation. And we were up all night till dawn. I remember partying from him many times. It's just that the sun was rising, and I'd walk back across campus to my apartment complex. And so this went on for a while, and the two of us became known as the two guys that you talked to at Coffee Plantation. John and this other individual, they're the guys you want to go to. They're the guys who know stuff. And pretty soon we had this circle of intellectuals surrounding us. One guy was he was a middle-aged Marxist guy. Another guy was into science. All these kids, one kid was an anthropologist studying at ASU. And we all just started, we would, after a while, we'd go over to a Denny's, and we all sit around in Denny's talking about science, art, philosophy, culture, myth, you name it, in this roundtable discussion. It was incredible energy. The whole place was just crackling with energy. It was amazing. Tempe in those days, it's since been killed by gentrification. It's gone. Those coffee shops are gone. They no longer exist. Tempe is in a sad state right now. It's really too bad what happened to it. But back then, it was the place to be. And so eventually one night, I met who would be this girl who would become my first real girlfriend, real in the sense of a full-blown sexual, mature, actual relationship. And I bumped into her at one of these coffee shops. She was working on a degree in music. She was gorgeous, darkly beautiful, brunette, dark eyes, absolutely gorgeous. And she was working on some problem, I forget what it was, that she had heard that I might be able to help her with. So she came to me and I helped her solve her homework problems. She was also an artist, a very skilled, talented artist. And we just clicked right away. We hit it off. I mean, it was electric. We went back up to her dorm room, and then she moved right in with me in my studio apartment. And we had sex like rabbits for almost every day for 4 months. The next 4 months, it was a blur. And she was very talented, and I enjoyed watching her do her paintings. And they were amazing. They were absolutely amazing. But she had psychic abilities that she didn't know what to do with. Now, she wasn't a medium. A medium is someone who can communicate with the dead. she had the ability to get into my head and to remember my memories. So she could pull memories out seemingly at random, and she would say, I remember the table that you had. I don't know where it was, but it was a black Formica top, speckles on it, and it had a silver band going around the edge. I was like, yes, I remember that table. That was at my grandmother's house, my maternal grandmother's house. I have an actual photograph at my mom's house that I could get to show you the exact table. I was blown away. And she was like, remember that time you dressed up as Dracula for Halloween and you didn't want to take your brother out because you were embarrassed because you wanted to go out with your other friends and he was too young to go with your crowd. Remember that? And I was like, yes, I do. And then she could remember my grandfather's suicide, which was even creepier. She walked me through all the details of what happened that night, of him doing the dishes for the last time, putting them away in a very careful order. And he had already decided to do it long before he was at the fireplace, standing there, spinning the revolver before he shot himself. And that was really weird and creepy. And she was, there was this aura of the supernatural about her. She was always in touch with the astral plane in one way or another. We would walk into a place and she'd be like, I can't handle the people's energy in here. Or she'd freak out about some dude. She'd be like, that guy, I can't be around him. He's thinking things I don't want to get into. So she would pick up on people's thought vibrations, and she was extremely sensitive, and it really harmed her. Very, very introverted. She was crying a lot. She was an adopted kid. Just a mess psychologically, basically. But I fell in love with her. I did love her, and I did ask her to marry me, and we were going to get married. So all this stuff was happening. I was really excited. And then it just crashed and burned one night, and I can't even remember why. It's very hazy. It just crashed and burned one night, and she was out the door from some argument or other, and that was it for that. I saw her a lot, though, because she was in the same social circles at Coffee Plantation there. So I saw her a lot, but she never said another word to me. We never said another word to each other after that. So that was kind of, I was very upset. I was brokenhearted. I went home. I had to stay with my mom for a little while just to get some comfort. I was crying a lot, and she was like, you're miserable. You got to cut this shit out. Go get a job. Go do something with your life. Don't just sit around and feel sorry for yourself. And she was making good progress in her college studies, by the way. She was on her way to getting her degree as a substance abuse counselor. She was doing very well. And she had become, over the years now, our relationship was getting better and better. And she had become my confidant now, the go-to person that I told everything that happened to me. I was always on the phone to Mom. I was like, Mom, can you help me with this? And she always had the right advice. She always knew what the situation was and how I could solve it and what I could do. She straightened her shit out, you know. So I went back to my apartment and continued living there for a while, continued going to Coffee Plantation. Now, I had written a letter about a year prior to this, to the Joseph Campbell Foundation. I'd read everything Campbell, every single word Campbell wrote. And I knew that I had read in his biography that the Joseph Campbell Foundation had formed as an entity to preserve and protect Campbell's legacy, but also they were editing all of his posthumous writings, a whole bunch of manuscripts that he had left behind. And so it took an entire year. I wrote them a letter asking, you know, if they needed help with this. I know all this Campbell stuff. And I didn't think anything of it after I sent the letter. And then a year went by, and they wrote back, and they said, well, actually, we could use your assistance. We're editing his posthumous books, his travel diaries when he went to India and to Japan as 2 separate volumes, and we'd like you to put the footnotes in for those. Do cross-references to where he's developing this idea that later turns up in the Masks of God on what page. Find the page for us and cross-reference. I was like, that's effortless. So I did that, and the first round of that, and they were very impressed. So they gave me a job working for them for about the next 5 years. I survived on a very small monthly stipend. I had to do odd jobs to supplement the stipend, but I was surviving. And I was starting to figure this shit out. I mean, I didn't want to go back to college for higher degrees because I knew that they would try to make me specialize. And I was too interested in culture and the arts and everything, history and philosophy. I wanted the big picture, and I knew they would crush my big picture into a small, tiny little thing, a paltry specialty. I knew that's what they would do. I knew they would fight me all the way. especially since as I had taken, while I was working at ASU, I had taken a class there, because you could get some free classes if you were an employee on the campus. And I took a class on James Joyce, and I already knew way more than the professor knew about James Joyce from having read Campbell. Campbell started as a Joyce scholar, and I knew Joyce backwards and forwards. And the guy didn't like me. He was almost everything I said he took issue with. And I was like, this isn't going to work. And so that was my first clue that going back to school was not going to be the right decision for me. So the question became how to do this. I remember starting a 9-to-5 job at Bank of America as soon as I got out. And been living at home for a year, and my mother told me, go get a job. The first job I got before the ASU job was working at Bank of America, wearing a tie, going in 9 to 5, like Bartleby the Scrivener, going in there, and all these people in there. And I thought the whole thing was ludicrous. I laughed at it. After 2 weeks of that, I just walked out without a word. I knew I wasn't going to do that. I would prefer not to work at Bank of America, to quote Bartleby again. So I didn't know how it was going to work or whether it was going to work. I was just surviving in between jobs, doing odd jobs, and then writing gigs just started slowly coming my way with the Campbell Foundation coming my way. And then I met the woman about a year after that relationship. I met the woman at the same place, the same coffee plantation environment, who would become my wife. So we'll pick up with that next time.